Hi, this is Inform TV 100. Well, guys, we are finally finishing up the book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. Happy Black History Month. We have really celebrated strongly every day of Black History Month, but and we will still be reading Black history for the rest of the year. Uh, Moving forward, we're going to be covering the grift. Now that we're done with Frederick Douglass, we are going to be reading parts of the grift for the rest of the year. Please get the book, The Grift, the downward spiral of Black Republicans from the Party of Lincoln to the Cult of Trump by Clay Cane, Cane, and Clay. And don't forget to VOTE. It's primaries in certain places. Vote for your best interests. Vote for policies. Do not vote against yourself. Non voting, not voting is voting against yourself. Okay, so we're going to finish up the book. Uh, the narrative, The Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. It was written by a slave, an ex slave. Frederick Douglass, he escaped, you guys. Frederick Douglass, through all the brutality, born into slavery, he escaped. He escaped to New York. He didn't give a lot of details about his mode of escape because he wrote this book during the time where there were people who were still enslaved. So he didn't give all the details because he didn't want to ruin the chance of other people getting help and getting free. Hey, so he starts talking about when he went to the north, everything looked nice, and the people didn't have slaves, but yet the place was very nice for people. And he was just talking about there were no half naked children, no barefoot women, as I was accustomed to seeing in Maryland. The people looked healthier, happier, and more able than any I ever had seen. For once, I could see extreme wealth without being saddened by seeing extreme poverty alongside of it. To me, however, the most astonishing and interesting thing was the condition of the blacks. Like me, many of them had escaped to New Bedford from slavery. I found many who had been free less than 7 years, but were living in finer houses and enjoying more of life's comforts than the average Maryland slaveholder. My friend Nathan Johnson lived in a neater house, dined at a better table, read more newspapers, and better understood the nation's moral, religious, and political character than 9/10 of the slaveholders in Talbot County, Maryland. Yet Nathan was a working man. His hands were hardened by toil and were those of his wife. I found the blacks much more spirited than I had expected. They shared a determination to protect one another from bloodthirsty kidnappers. Soon after my arrival, I heard a story that illustrated the spirit. A free black and a fugitive slave were on unfriendly terms. The freeman was heard threatening to tell the runaway's masters where to find the fugitive. Immediately, the black community called a meeting to discuss business of importance. They invited the free man at the meeting. The people appointed an old religious gentleman as chairman. This gentleman offered a prayer and then said, "Friends, we have got him here. I recommend that you young men take him outside and kill him." A number of men bolted at the freeman, but others stopped them. The betrayer escaped and has not been seen in New Bedford since. 3 days after my arrival, I found employment helping to load a ship with barrels of oil. It was a new, dirty, and hard work for me, but I did it with a glad heart and willingly. I was my own master. Only those who have been slaves can understand the joy that I felt. For the first time, my earnings were my own. No Hugh odds stood ready to rob me of them. I worked with a pleasure that I never had experienced before. I was working for myself, and my new wife, a new existence had begun. When I finished that job, I looked for work as a caulker, but there was prejudice among the white caulkers, and they refused to work with me. Unable to work at my trade, I prepared to do any kind of work I could get. Nathan kindly lent me his saw and carpentry horse, and I soon had plenty of jobs. There was no work too dirty or too hard. I was ready to saw wood, shovel coal, sweep chimneys, or roll oil barrels. I did all this for nearly 3 years before I became known to the anti slavery world. About 4 months after I arrived in New Bedford, I started subscribing to the literature. I read the newspaper from week to week and with deeper feelings that I can describe. It became my meat and drink. It set my soul on fire in sympathy for my fellow slaves, denunciations of slaveholders, exposures of slavery, and powerful attacks on slavery defended defenders thrilled me. The Liberator introduced me to the principles, activities, and spirit of the anti slavery movement. I took up the cause. I could do only a little, but I did it joyfully. I was happiest when attending an anti slavery meeting. I seldom said much at the meetings because what I wanted to say was said better by others. But at any anti slavery convention in Nantucket, we were at a anti-slavery convention in Nantucket on August the 11th, 1841. I felt strongly moved to speak. William C. Coffin, who had heard me speak at a Black People's meeting in New Bedford, encouraged me to do so. I was hesitant. I still thought of myself as a slave. The idea of speaking to whites intimidated. But after I spoke a few minutes, I spoke freely with ease. From that time on, I have devoted myself to pleading the cause of my fellow slaves. I leave it to those acquainted with my efforts to decide my degree of success. Now to we're going to go over. We're done, guys. We're done. We're done. We're going to I'm going to read the appendix. And so, Inform TV 100. Don't forget to hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to share. Sharing is caring. We are finished. We read the entire book of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. And I'm going to read the appendix. It's only a page and a half. Uh, Having read over my story, I realize some of what I have written might lead readers to mistake me for an enemy of all religions. What I have said against religion applies only to the religion of slaveholders and those in league with them, not to Christianity itself. I recognize the greatest possible difference between the two because I love the pure, peaceable Christianity of Christ. I hate the corrupt, cruel Christianity of those who support slavery. Indeed, I see no reason except deception to call such a religion Christianity. I loathe the horrible hypocrisy of slaveholders. Christianity, slaveholding communities have cradle robbers for church members, women whippers for missionaries, and men stealers for ministries. People who wield the blood clotted whip during the week stand in the pulpit on Sunday claiming to be ministers of meek, lowly Jesus. People who rob slaves of their earnings appear as teachers at Sunday morning, instructing slaves about the path to salvation. People who sell slave women for the purpose of prostitution call themselves pious advocates of purity. People who proclaim in a religious dairy to read the Bible deny slaves the right to learn to read the Word of God. Religious advocates of marriage rob millions of its sacred influence. Defenders of the sacredness of families scatter families, tearing apart husbands and wives, parents and children, sisters and brothers. Thieves preach against theft, and adulterers against adultery. Money used to build churches, support preaching, and purchase Bibles is acquired, and the purchase of Bibles is acquired through the sale of women, men, and babies. Slave holders insist on religion's outward forms while ignoring weighty matters of judgment, mercy, and faith. I earnestly hope that this little book will throw light on the American slave system and hasten the glad day of deliverance of my millions of brothers and sisters who are in bonds. I rely on the power of truth, love, and justice, and solemnly pledge myself anew to the sacred cause. Signed, Frederick Douglass, Lynn, Massachusetts, April 28th, 1845. And we're going to read the afterword about the author. The author was Frederick Douglass, and it ends his narrative. Ends his narrative. He is a young married man of about 24, newly arrived in the free state of Massachusetts and just beginning to be known as a public speaker. He closes his book by saying that he is pleading the cause of my fellow slaves. I leave it to the acquainted with my efforts to decide any degree of success. How successful was Douglass in pleading the cause? The fact is that the publication of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass made its author a famous and influential man. It put him in the spotlight, and that at first was not a comfortable position for him. But let's back up a little and fill in some important gaps in Douglas' story. First of all, how did he escape from slavery? As Douglas explained in his narrative, he could not provide details without getting either other people in trouble. But years later, after slavery was abolished in the United States, he did publish the story of his escape. In Baltimore, he had become friends with a free black man, a sailor named Benny. Benny offered to lend his own identity papers to Douglas for his journey north. Now, using the papers was very dangerous for both Douglas and Benny. Benny could be arrested for helping Douglas, and Douglas, of course, would be returned to slavery if he was caught. To make matters worse, Benny and Douglas looked nothing alike, and Benny's papers included a description of their owner. Taking Benny's papers, Douglas dressed as a sailor and boarded a train headed north. Thanks to his work in the shipyards, Douglas could talk the talk of a sailor, and he managed to escape suspicion. His papers were checked several times, but not carefully. He even met several white people who knew him as a slave in Baltimore, but dressed in his sailor's clothing, they didn't give him a second glance. Still feeling miserably anxious, he rode the train from Baltimore into Delaware, also a slave state. There he boarded a boat to Philadelphia and from there took another train to New York, where he picks up his story again in the narrative. In 1841, that Douglas spoke at a meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society describing what freedom meant to him. The society was so impressed that it immediately hired him to lecture about his experience as a slave. Audiences were spellbound by Douglas, who was by all accounts a powerful public speaker. Some pro slavery writers, worried about the publicity Douglas was receiving, accused him of being a fraud. They said he was too literate and too articulate to have ever really been a slave. To prove them wrong, Douglas wrote his narrative, in which he provided names, dates, and places related to his days spent in slavery. The book was an instant sensation, eventually selling over 30,000 copies in the United States and Britain. It was translated into French, German, and Dutch. While Douglas was happy that the book raised people's awareness of the horrors of slavery, its publication also put him in a frightening position. Now, everyone knew that he was an escaped slave and that under Maryland law, he was the property of his old master. Any slave hunter could have captured him, forced him to return to Maryland, and collected a reward. To avoid capture, Douglas fled to Europe in August 1845. He spent the next 20 months on a lecture tour of England, Scotland, and Ireland. During that time, anti slavery groups in England raised enough money to purchase his freedom. When Douglas could safely return to the U.S., he moved to Rochester, New York. There he found the North Star, an anti slavery newspaper. His reputation as a spokesman for African Americans kept him in the public eye for the rest of his life. He organized a protest against segregated schools in Rochester. His home was a stop on the Underground Railroad, the network that helped runaway slaves reach safety in the North when the Civil War began in 1861. President Abraham Lincoln met Douglas twice to discuss the role of black soldiers in the Union Army. In 1877, President Rutherford Hayes appointed Douglas U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. He later served as U.S. Minister to Haiti. Throughout his long life, Douglas remained a fiery spokesman for racial equality. He also became involved in the fight for women's rights, becoming friends with many of the leading feminists of his day. On February 20th, 1895, he attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C., where the audience gave him a standing ovation. Shortly after returning home that day, he had a heart attack and died. After his death, a eulogy for Frederick Douglass was presented by Reverend Alexander Cromwell, well known Black activist. Reverend Cromwell's words are a fitting close to a discussion of Douglass' life. He wrote,